Hello, this is again Dr. Jonathan Bentovish. I've presented already a little bit about this new God's Physics book, a new scientific paradigm for the 21st century. And this book, published by iuniverse.com, I've written especially for the layman population. The reason being because this new paradigm of the God's physics or the computational unified field theory, this new paradigm is no doubt revolutionizing 21st century theoretical physics. There's been over 50 peer-reviewed articles published so far, a special issue by global journals. This book, however, the God's Physics book, I've written for the general public because I believe that this revolution in science has to be broadcasted to the general public because it has great significance, not just for scientists, but for every human being today, especially given the times that we live in with the pandemic and everything. So I want to explain in simple terms sort of an overview of what this new God's physics paradigm is all about. And I'm going to try and explain that in layman terms. You know that Einstein, about 100 years ago, revolutionized science with his relativity theory. Relativity theory talks about the universe, the galaxies, so that's the macroscopic level, and he revolutionized science by discovering relativity theory. Before his time, there was Newtonian mechanics and Maxwellian theory, and there is a very famous philosopher of science by the name of Thomas Kuhn, who in 1962 wrote a book, a very influential book, termed or called the on the scientific the structure of scientific revolutions, and he essentially explained that science is a human undertaking and it undergoes evolution, steps and phases that it evolves by. I like to give the metaphor. I gave it in this God's Physics book. I like to give a metaphor which is akin to what Thomas Kuhn was describing. Imagine that you were born in a room, and that is a small confined room, and from your birth date, all you know of the world is just this room. You're convinced that the whole world is just the room. And then, lo and behold, you hear knocks on the door, or maybe you see something going through the window, sticking through the window, and you realize that there's something outside the room. What you thought was the whole world is really, there's something beyond it. And so you open the door, and you find out that the room is embedded or encapsulated within an apartment or a house. And consequently, by the way, the next phase will be that you open the door of the house and you see that the house is part of a neighborhood, etc., etc. And that's how, in a sense, science evolves. So Thomas Kuhn was teaching us, and Einstein demonstrated that, and now we stand at the exact brink of another scientific revolution or expansion. Essentially, that science goes through phases in which it has a paradigm, it has a small room through which binoculars through which it looks at the world. And then that room is too confined, and we start finding that there is phenomena that do not fit into that room. So then, therefore, science has to go through what is called a paradigmatic shift, or an expansion of the room into the house, and then into the neighborhood, and then into the country, and then into the world, etc. That's a metaphor, but that essentially teaches us or demonstrates the idea that science has to evolve and expand its understanding. And indeed, the great Einstein, he revolutionized and expanded our understanding from Newtonian mechanics to relativity theory, and then came along quantum mechanics, which Einstein was the father of, but then other scientists joined quantum mechanics, and Einstein was not completely satisfied with the theory, and in any event he said that quantum mechanics and relativity theory, quantum mechanics is about the subatomic world, relativity theory is about the macroscopic world, the universe. These two theories seem to contradict, and so they also call now for an expansion, for another paradigmatic shift. Interestingly, by the way, I mentioned this in the book, when Einstein was asked, what do you think would be the fate of your relativity theory in 100 years? Would it last forever? Would it be considered the ultimate truth? Einstein, being very humble and one of the two greatest geniuses that science has ever known, his relativity theory is considered the greatest intellectual achievement of one individual human being. Einstein, being very humble, said, no, I do not believe that my relativity theory will hold forever. I only hope and believe that my relativity theory would become a special case in a broader understanding. So he realized that the same way that he expanded Newtonian mechanics into relativity theory, Newtonian mechanics became a special case in relativity theory for non-relativistic speeds, etc. The same way he realized, and he was actually looking for what he called a unifying field theory. That unifying field theory is a theory that should merge and bridge the gap between relativity theory about the macroscopic world and quantum mechanics about the microscopic world, which today, or actually since Einstein's time, seem to contradict each other. More troubling is the fact that we have a phenomenon, the accelerated expansion of the universe. The universe is being expanded more and more rapidly. When we look at the galaxies, we see them setting apart from each other at a much higher and higher rate. And science, in order to explain that phenomena, has to assume that there is 95% more mass and energy in the universe than can actually be observed. And science calls it, or hypothesizes, that it comprises dark matter, dark energy. But no direct evidence or verification of this dark matter, dark energy has been obtained, despite numerous attempts to do so. And that, by the way, is very reminiscent of what happened with Einstein. When Einstein came along, physics assumed that there is an ether element perfusing the universe, a very subtle element. Michelson, Morley, other experimenters tried to find that ether concept and could not find it. And then Einstein, the great Einstein, said, well, if it cannot be observed, then we have to discard it. So he said it's superfluous, it doesn't exist. He added a few theoretical postulates, and he founded and discovered relativity theory, which is obviously a huge achievement. But relativity theory and quantum mechanics have to be expanded now because they seem contradictory of each other. Perhaps I'll give a small metaphor. I like to use metaphors. King Solomon obviously said that any truth can be explained in up to 3,000 metaphors. So I like to use metaphors. Let me give a small metaphor. If you were flying over a beautiful garden and there was a building there, a mansion covered with gold and swans swimming in the pool, a very beautiful mansion, and you'd be photographing in an aerial view that mansion, and you're convinced it's a mansion. Imagine that you then have a pedestrian going into the mansion, going into the house, and giving you photographs, and from the inside of the house, the flooring and everything, it seems like a hut. And obviously you would say that's not possible. How could the same building be a mansion from the outside and a hut inside? That's not realistic. That's the situation that we have today in science. That's the crisis that Einstein revolutionized science, expanded the room as we spoke, from Newtonian mechanics into relativity theory and quantum mechanics to a certain extent. And now science again stands in a contradiction between these two pillars of 20th century physics, the relativity theory about the universe and microscopic world, quantum mechanics about the subatomic particles. They seem to contradict the old, what I call material causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics. Cannot explain where up to 95% of all the mass and energy in the universe, where they exist. And so physics right now in science has to go a real paradigmatic shift in order to explain better and to really understand the universe. So there comes along the new God's physics paradigm, which again is described to the layman reader in this God's physics book published by iUniverse. So the God's physics new paradigm is very exciting. It does unify between relativity theory and quantum mechanics. It resolves their apparent inconsistencies. And I want to try and explain it in simple terms in a short time, just the highlights. So this God's physics new paradigm of 21st century theoretical physics, what does it say? It says, first of all, it discovered the existence of a singular, higher ordered universal computational or universal consciousness principle, UCP. That UCP, that higher ordered universal computational or consciousness principle, it computes every spatial pixel in the universe. It produces a rapid series of frames. I give a metaphor of a film. When you look at a film, a cinematic film, and let's say you see a jet plane zooming through the screen, and you're convinced that jet plane has a velocity, has an energy. But if you stop the film, you can observe that the plane doesn't have an energy or velocity, but it's presented one time here and then another time here and another frame here. And the displacement across the frames gives us the impression, the perception that it has a velocity. Same way, this new God's physics paradigm essentially says that the whole universe is being created, dissolved, recreated, and evolved by this UCP, by this universal consciousness principle. It produces a very rapid, extremely rapid, in fact, it's many billions of times per second, but it produces extremely rapid series of frames. Each frame comprises the whole universe, and it exists for a billionth of a billionth of a billionth of a second, and it's computed every point in that frame, the whole universe, every point in it, every atom, every point is computed simultaneously by this universal consciousness principle. Between one frame and another, the whole universe dissolves back into this UCP. I represented that UCP, by the way, by the Hebrew letter Yud. You can see it here in the white Yud, the white dot here. And so this Yud, this UCP, it computes every pixel in the universe. It computes a whole series of pixels as a frame, and then a rapid series of frames, which gives us the impression of a continuous universe, material universe. And in fact, that's one of the beautiful and profound changes from this new God's physics. I call it a-causal computation paradigm, to relative to the old paradigm, which of 20th century physics of relativity theory and quantum mechanics, which I call the material causal paradigm. So let me say just a few words about that. That the old material causal paradigm, which has a lot of effect on our lives as well, assumes that everything in the universe functions by cause and effect. For example, relativity theory says that the whole universe was created by a Big Bang, an initial nuclear event. All the mass in the universe was condensed in a very small space, like a tennis ball, and then there was a nuclear event, and that erupted and created the suns, the galaxies, the planets, everything, our planet, everything, the energy, the mass. So this is a cause and effect, one element interacting with another material element and producing a result. That old material causal paradigm is now undermined. It has to be expanded, and simply because of the fact that when we understand that this UCP, Universal Consciousness Principle, computes all the pixels in the universe simultaneously. So for each frame, all of the points in the frame, all of the atoms in the universe are computed simultaneously for every given frame. And between one frame and another, the whole universe dissolves back into this Yud. It doesn't exist. So we have to realize that there cannot be any interaction in one frame. No two or more spatial pixels, atoms or planets or whatever, cannot interact with each other because they're computed simultaneously by this UCP. Between frames, the whole universe dissolves, so there cannot be an effect from one frame to another frame except through the memory and the consciousness of this universal consciousness principle. Quite amazing. So we reach a new understanding that the universe is not a continuous entity, material entity. The universe is actually being created and recreated and dissolved and evolved solely by the reality of this universal consciousness reality or principle. And in fact, one of the postulates of this new theory, I call it the computational invariance principle, essentially says that since only this UCP exists continuously, both in between the frames, where the universe dissolves back into the UCP, and during the frames where it computes the mass, time, energy, and space of every pixel, it computes them. Since the only thing that continuously exists and constantly exists is this UCP, Universal Consciousness Principle, Universal Consciousness Reality, whereas the universe and the four physical basic features of space, time, energy, and mass, what we know of in the universe, they exist only during the frames as produced by the UCP, but they dissolve between the frames. This computational invariance principle essentially says that we only have one constant reality, which is this universal consciousness reality. And the universe is really a manifestation, a transient, like a temporal. It exists only part of the time, not all the time. So it's a phenomena. It exists and disappears, exists and disappears. So the universe exists only as a manifestation of this universal consciousness reality. So how does it change our universe? Why is it important? Why is this God's physics so profoundly important for our understanding of the universe, and how does it affect our life? Obviously, I can't explain all of that in a short video, but I will present other videos, and people are invited to read the book, which published by iuniverse.com. This book does explain it in simple terms. So the change in our conception of the universe is that the universe is not a material entity. It was not created by a Big Bang nuclear event. It does not drift into nothingness all by chance. Our human existence was not created by what Darwin in evolutionary theory explains, again, as a random occurrence, random phenomena, just interaction, survival of the fittest. The organisms that are most compatible to the environment, they survive. Those that are not compatible, they are extinct. And it's also an interplay of cosmic rays that cause mutations, changes, random changes in genetic material, which causes the change in the species. That's not possible any longer with the new paradigm. The new paradigm says something quite amazing. It says that the only reality that exists really is this universal consciousness reality. It says that actually this universal consciousness reality has a plan, and from the beginning of the universe, through every split billionth of a second that the universe is being created and recreated and dissolved and evolved by this universal consciousness reality, at every split second, billionth of a second, from the beginning till the ultimate goal, so to speak, of the universe, this universal consciousness reality has a plan. That plan is to evolve the universe from inanimate matter to animate forms like plants, then animals, then human beings. And then human beings evolve their consciousness, expand their consciousness through science also, by the way, to reach that goal of understanding, realization of the perfected state of humanity and the world. That perfected state in Jewish terminology is called Geula, redemption. But that Geula state essentially says that the whole universe is evolving, the universal conscious reality is evolving the whole universe towards that perfected state, which is a state in which humanity would realize that it's all one, that there is oneness in the universe, and that oneness, that only singular reality is this universal consciousness reality, God in religious terms. In scientific terms, that's universal consciousness reality, that's the only thing that really exists. And by the way, the whole evolution of the universe is characterized through or dependent on the characterization of this universal consciousness reality. So we have 10 laws of hierarchical manifestation, which I write about, but essentially they're telling us that this universal conscious reality cares about our moral choices. In fact, it talks about multiple futures that are possible for every human being. So for this universal conscious reality, there is a bank of all the past, present, and future, multiple future possible frames, universal frames, or realities of the world, the physical reality, which depend on our moral choice. I will elaborate on this on other presentations, but it's the first time where we understand that because we're all one with this universal consciousness reality, and actually that reality is the only sole real reality, we're part of that. Therefore, that reality has a moral principle embedded within it. I call it the dynamic equilibrium moral principle, which essentially says that when we choose to better another human being or make a moral choice, a good moral choice, we will reap the same results ourselves, because that universal conscious reality will present to us or will involve us in a very similar situation. The same goodness that we imparted to another human being, we will reap as well, and vice versa. And that the universal conscious reality is steering humanity and the whole universe, again, from inanimate matter through animate plants, animals, human beings, and then to this Geula state, this perfected moral, spiritual state. That's the evolution of the universe. It's quite exciting because we understand that nothing happens by chance in the universe. It's all being computed, created, recreated, and guided by this universal conscious reality. That universal conscious reality is typified, is characterized by all goodness characterization. In other words, that it does impart life and health and happiness and abundance and creates the whole universe and evolves the whole universe, cares about every human being, about every plant, about every animal. So this is a whole new conception of the universe. It fulfills Einstein's dream or vision to unify all of the forces of nature in one formula. And perhaps towards the end of my presentation today, I'll show you that in this book there is a universal consciousness formula at the bottom, and that universal consciousness formula actually uses or embeds Einstein's E equals mc squared in a broader understanding, and also quantum mechanics, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, in a broader understanding. And so we stand at a very exciting time. It's relevant, by the way, for the pandemic and for the situation that we stand in, because our moral choice do matter, and the universe is guided and it is being governed by the plan of this universal consciousness reality. It's a very exciting time. I wrote this God's Physics book for the layman because I think that this scientific revolution that's taking place in science and physics is not only for scientists. It's actually a very exciting time for humanity, and it's critical that all human beings would be aware of that. It does affect our lives. It gives us a great sense of responsibility and meaning about our moral choices, about this transition into this universal consciousness reality recognition, and ultimately reaching that Geula state in which there will be peace and harmony, no wars, no aggression, all humanity uniting in recognition and in appreciation of this singular, higher ordered reality. It's a pleasure to present that to you, and I invite everybody to read this book.